The marketplace was alive with voices, laughter, and the noisy hum of everyday life. Stalls stretched in long rows, each one crowded with fruits, cloth, or trinkets brought in from distant towns. People walked back and forth, bargaining loudly, gossiping with neighbors, and shouting out prices as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Among the crowd walked a woman named Elena, her posture straight and her steps measured. She wore a plain blouse, a long skirt, and carried a small basket tucked under her arm. At first glance, she looked like any other villager going about her day, blending into the stream of people who passed through the market square. But Elena was not an ordinary woman. She had lived through storms that few could imagine. Behind her calm face lay years of service in a war that had scarred her body and her spirit. Her neighbors only knew her as the quiet woman who moved into the edge of town a few years ago, who kept to herself and never raised her voice. Some respected her silence, while others whispered rumors. Why does she never talk about her past, one would ask. Where did she come from? What is she hiding, another would add. People always spoke when they did not understand someone, and Elena had long learned to ignore their chatter. On this particular day, however, ignoring would not be so easy. A group of young men lingered near one of the cloth stalls. They were the type who sought attention, laughing too loudly and making fun of anyone who crossed their path. They were not evil at heart, but careless in their words, eager to look powerful in front of each other. When they noticed Elena walking past them, they smirked. She carried herself with a dignity they did not understand. To them, she was just a quiet, plain woman who thought too highly of herself by ignoring their stares. One of them whispered to the others, "She acts like she's better than us." Another replied, "Let's see how proud she looks after a little fun." They chuckled together, not realizing that the moment they were about to create would change the way the whole town saw her. Elena felt their eyes on her but said nothing. She walked calmly, stopping at a stall that sold dried herbs. Her hand reached for a pouch of thyme when the laughter behind her grew louder. She turned slightly, her expression still calm, though inside her heart tightened. She had seen this kind of cruelty before, long ago, in different uniforms and under darker skies. The difference was that back then, she had been trained to fight back. Now, she only wanted peace. The young men stepped closer, pretending to joke among themselves, but their words were sharp enough for others to hear. "Look at her clothes, so old-fashioned," one said mockingly. "She must think silence makes her important." The vendor at the herb stall frowned, but said nothing, not wanting trouble near his booth. Elena ignored the comments and paid for her herbs, placing the pouch into her basket. She turned to leave, but the group blocked her path. For the first time, her eyes met theirs. There was no fear in her gaze, only a quiet patience that unsettled them more than they cared to admit. But pride pushed them to go further. One of them spoke louder now, so everyone around could hear. "Tell us, old woman, why do you walk like a soldier? Who do you think you are?" The crowd began to notice the commotion. People slowed their steps, curious about the scene. A few shook their heads, knowing these young men often sought trouble, but no one interfered. Elena stood in the middle, surrounded, with her basket clutched against her arm. She could have answered back. She could have told them who she was, what she had endured, the battles she had fought and the friends she had lost. But words were not her weapon now. Silence was. Her calmness only provoked them further. Another young man muttered something about her being too proud, and laughter followed. Elena's hands tightened around the basket, but her face remained unreadable. Inside, however, she was remembering. She was remembering the battlefield, the smoke, the cries of the wounded, and the moment she had sworn never again to let anger guide her actions. Still, the marketplace had grown quiet now. The air seemed heavy, waiting. Children pulled closer to their mothers. Vendors paused their work, watching carefully. Everyone wondered how this would end. Then, a voice from the crowd called out, "Leave her alone." An older man, gray-haired and leaning on a cane, spoke with firmness. He recognized Elena, though not fully. He had once seen her return from town late at night, her gait strong, her face pale but proud, as though carrying burdens unseen. The young men sneered at the interruption, but they did not back down. They wanted the last laugh, the final word, the attention of the crowd. Elena finally raised her voice, low but steady. "You do not know me," she said simply. "And perhaps it is better that way." Her words silenced them for a moment, for there was weight in her tone, a depth that did not match the ordinary clothes she wore. It was as if she carried the echoes of 1,000 unspoken stories in that single sentence. The young men exchanged uncertain glances, but pride held them still. They had wanted to shame her, but instead they had drawn the whole market into watching. Elena, however, did not tremble. She stood tall, with the same poise she had once used when standing in formation among soldiers, when discipline mattered more than fear. The marketplace remained tense, filled with whispers and quiet stares. No one yet knew what would unfold, but it was clear to all that Elena was not a woman who would break easily under mockery. What the crowd and those young men did not realize was that beneath her simple blouse and calm demeanor lay scars that told a story more powerful than any insult. And soon, those scars would be revealed, not by her choice, but by the carelessness of those who sought to humiliate her. When that moment came, the entire marketplace would fall silent, their laughter frozen, their pride shattered. For now, though, Elena stood firm, like a tree against the wind, quietly holding her ground as the eyes of the town turned upon her. The silence in the marketplace felt heavy, almost as if the air itself had grown still. Elena stood tall with her basket clutched close, and the group of young men lingered around her, not quite ready to back away, but not fully confident either. The crowd that had gathered was watching, some curious, others uneasy, and still others hoping for a quick end to the tension. Elena's calm voice from moments before still rang in their ears, "You do not know me. And perhaps it is better that way." Those words carried weight, though the young men did not yet understand why. But instead of walking away, pride pushed them further. One of them, taller than the rest and eager to prove himself the boldest, stepped closer. He smirked and raised his voice. "If you have nothing to hide, then why stay silent? If you are as strong as you act, then show us who you are." His words were sharp, but underneath them was insecurity, for even he felt uneasy standing so close to Elena. The marketplace grew restless. A woman selling bread whispered to her neighbor, "They shouldn't do this. That woman is not ordinary." Her neighbor nodded but did not speak. Children stared with wide eyes, not fully grasping the seriousness but sensing that something important was happening. Elena did not answer the tall young man. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and her eyes looked past him as though he were no more than a shadow. This only stoked his pride. He wanted a reaction: laughter, fear, anger, anything but her calm silence unnerved him. He reached out, as if to test her resolve. The crowd gasped softly, expecting Elena to recoil. But instead, she stood unmoving, her gaze steady, like a soldier facing down an enemy line. This stillness embarrassed him further. He wanted her to look small, weak, or afraid. Instead, she looked unshakable. "Why do you wear those old clothes?" another of the young men jeered, trying to shift the attention. "Do you think you're above us? Do you think you are someone special?" His voice carried mockery, but beneath it was the same nervous energy his friend felt. They had started something they no longer fully controlled. Elena spoke again, her voice calm, though softer now, almost as if she were speaking to herself. "There is nothing special about me. Only stories written on skin that will never fade." Her words puzzled them. Stories written on skin? The younger men exchanged confused glances. Some of the onlookers, however, seemed to understand. An older woman, her face lined with age, whispered, "She speaks of scars." Another man, who had once fought in a border conflict decades ago, stiffened. He looked at Elena with new eyes. The young men still didn't understand, and pride once again urged them forward. "Scars? What scars?" one of them laughed. "If you have them, then show them. Let us see if your words carry truth." The crowd stirred, some frowning at the boldness of the request. A few even muttered in disapproval. But the young men had already gone too far. They wanted to push Elena into revealing something, anything, that would make her look foolish. For a moment, Elena said nothing. She looked at the ground, her lashes lowering, and her silence made the moment feel endless. She remembered the battlefield, the chaos, the fire, the shouts of her comrades. She remembered the blast that had knocked her to the ground, the sharp pain that had burned into her chest, and the long nights afterward in a field hospital. Those scars were not marks of shame, but symbols of survival, of sacrifice, of promises kept. And yet, she had spent years keeping them hidden. She had chosen silence because peace had been her gift after the storm. Now these careless voices were pushing her toward a decision she had never wanted to make in front of strangers. The tall young man pressed again, raising his chin as though daring her. "Well? You claim to carry stories. Show us if you speak truth." A ripple of discomfort ran through the marketplace. Several townsfolk looked uneasy, and one vendor shook his head. "This is too much," he muttered. But no one stepped forward. The air was thick with curiosity, and though some disapproved, none could look away. Elena slowly lifted her gaze. Her eyes met those of the tall young man, and something in her expression changed. It was no longer quiet patience but firm resolve. She realized that perhaps this moment had come for a reason. Perhaps the scars she carried were not only for her but also for those who needed to understand what survival truly meant. "Very well," she said softly, though her voice carried through the square. "You want to see? Then you will see. But remember, what you witness is not for your amusement. It is the price of peace that you take for granted." The crowd fell into complete silence. Even the children stopped fidgeting, their eyes wide. The young men looked at each other, uncertain for the first time. They had expected resistance, anger, or retreat, not acceptance. Elena placed her basket gently on the ground. Her hands, steady though heavy with memory, reached toward the simple blouse she wore. She loosened the fabric just enough, and slowly, carefully, she pulled it aside. The marketplace gasped as one. Across her chest were deep, jagged scars, not small marks, but powerful lines etched permanently into her skin. They spoke of fire, of pain, of battles fought and survived. They were not wounds of weakness, but proof of unimaginable strength. The sunlight caught the uneven lines, and for the first time, everyone saw the truth she had carried silently for years. The young men froze where they stood. Their faces drained of mockery, replaced by shock. They had wanted to shame her, but now they were the ones shamed by their ignorance. The scars were not something to laugh at, they were sacred, heavy, and undeniable. A hush spread across the marketplace. No one dared to speak. Even the tall young man, who had been the loudest, found his lips trembling as he tried to find words. But there were none. Elena pulled her blouse back into place, covering herself once more. She did it calmly, with no anger, no shame. When she looked up, her eyes were clear and steady. "These scars," she said, her voice even, "are not for your entertainment. They are reminders of lives lost, of battles fought so that you may live freely in this town without fear. Do not ever mistake silence for weakness. And do not ever mock the weight of survival." The entire square remained silent. Some lowered their heads. Others blinked back tears. A few placed hands over their hearts, suddenly aware that the quiet woman who lived on the edge of town was more than they had ever imagined. The young men who had started it all stepped back. They had no more laughter, no more pride. Their bravado had vanished, replaced by shame. They had wanted to reveal her as a fraud, but instead, she had revealed herself as something far greater: a survivor, a protector, a warrior whose scars told stories more powerful than any words. And though Elena never sought attention, in that moment, she became a figure the town would never forget. The silence in the marketplace lingered long after Elena had covered herself again. The crowd stood as though frozen in time, their eyes still fixed on her. The scars they had just witnessed were not something easily forgotten. They were not marks of weakness but of survival, the kind of survival that most of the townsfolk could not even imagine. For years, Elena had been the quiet woman on the edge of town, distant, private, and unknown. People had whispered about her, judged her for her silence, and created stories to explain her isolation. But in just a few moments, everything they thought they knew had been shattered. The young men who had mocked her stood like statues, their faces pale. Their arrogance had drained away, leaving only shame in its place. They shifted awkwardly, glancing at one another, but none of them dared to meet Elena's eyes. Finally, the older man with the cane, the one who had spoken earlier, stepped forward. His voice trembled slightly but carried with it deep respect. "Daughter," he said softly, "you carry more than we can ever understand. Forgive their foolishness. Forgive us all for not seeing who you are." Elena's eyes softened. She did not want pity, nor did she crave forgiveness or glory. What she wanted was simple, peace, and for people to treat one another with kindness. She looked at the older man and gave a small nod, a gesture of quiet acceptance. But the stillness of the marketplace did not last forever. Murmurs soon spread through the crowd as people began to whisper to one another. "She is a veteran," someone said. "She fought in the war." Another added, "Those scars, she must have been in the worst of battles." The news traveled quickly, faster than the morning breeze. Within minutes, almost everyone in the square had heard the truth. The quiet woman they had once ignored or gossiped about was no ordinary villager. She had carried the weight of war, the weight of sacrifice, and lived to tell it with nothing more than silence and grace. The young men lowered their heads, their earlier pride replaced by heavy guilt. They had wanted to embarrass her, but instead, they had revealed their own ignorance. One of them finally whispered, "We didn't know, we didn't understand." His words barely carried through the crowd, but Elena heard them. She turned to face them, her eyes steady but not cruel. "Ignorance is not your greatest mistake," she said. "Pride is. Learn to respect what you do not understand, and you will not cause harm to others." Her voice, though calm, was firm, carrying a lesson not just for them but for everyone watching. The young men nodded slowly, too ashamed to argue. After a long pause, Elena bent down and picked up her basket. With simple dignity, she began to walk away. The crowd parted silently to give her space, no longer seeing her as a quiet stranger but as someone who carried the history of sacrifice on her shoulders. Every step she took seemed to echo with unspoken respect. Yet even as she walked away, Elena's mind was heavy. She had not wanted this. She had not wanted her scars to be shown to the world. They were hers, private reminders of battles and of friends she had lost. But perhaps, she thought, the moment had been necessary. Perhaps the young men and the entire town needed to be reminded that peace was never free. When she reached the edge of the marketplace, a young girl ran up to her. The child's eyes were wide but full of admiration. She carried a small flower in her hand, a bright red bloom she had plucked from a nearby stall without hesitation. Holding it up shyly, she said, "For you." Elena paused, her heart softening at the simple gesture. She knelt down, took the flower gently, and smiled. "Thank you, little one," she said softly. The girl beamed, then ran back to her mother, who watched with teary eyes. That moment touched Elena more deeply than the whispers of the crowd. For the child, there was no judgment, no curiosity, only pure respect and kindness. Over the next few days, word spread through the town. People began to speak of Elena not as the strange woman who kept to herself but as the survivor who had carried the weight of war. Some came to her door quietly, leaving food, flowers, or small gifts without saying a word. Others simply greeted her with newfound respect whenever she passed by. But Elena remained the same. She continued her quiet routines, tending her small garden, walking to the marketplace, and spending evenings in reflection. She had no desire for recognition or honor. What mattered to her was that perhaps the lesson had been learned that people would think twice before mocking those they did not understand. The young men who had tried to shame her changed the most. They avoided her for several days, too ashamed to face her. But slowly, each one found the courage to approach. One morning, the tall young man knocked on her door. He stood nervously, his eyes lowered. When she opened the door, he cleared his throat. "I came to apologize," he said quietly. "What we did was wrong. I was wrong. I thought you were just a quiet woman to laugh at. But now I know you are stronger than any of us. Please forgive me." Elena looked at him for a long moment. She saw the sincerity in his eyes, the humility in his posture. At last, she nodded. "You are forgiven," she said. "But remember, do not carry guilt alone. Carry change. Become someone who builds, not someone who destroys." The young man swallowed hard and nodded. He walked away with a heart heavy but changed, and in time, he shared that lesson with the others. The town itself began to shift as well. People grew more careful with their words, more thoughtful in their judgments. The marketplace, once a place of gossip and mockery, became quieter, more respectful. Elena's scars had become a silent teacher, a reminder that behind every face might lie a story that deserved dignity. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of orange and gold, Elena sat outside her small home. She looked at the flower the little girl had given her days earlier, now resting in a small jar of water. Its petals were beginning to fade, but its meaning was still fresh in her heart. She whispered softly to herself, "Perhaps the time for silence has ended. Perhaps it is time to share, not for myself, but for them." For the first time in years, she thought about telling her story. Not in full, not in every detail, but enough that the younger generation would understand the cost of the peace they enjoyed. She realized that her scars were not just hers, they were a legacy, a truth that should not be hidden forever. The stars began to appear one by one in the evening sky. Elena closed her eyes, breathing deeply, and let the cool night air wash over her. She felt lighter somehow, as though a burden had been lifted. She had carried her silence for so long, but now the world had seen her scars, and the weight of secrecy was gone. In the distance, she heard laughter, not the cruel kind, but the gentle, joyful laughter of children playing in the street. And for the first time in many years, Elena allowed herself to smile. The days that followed were filled with change. The town that had once whispered behind Elena's back now watched her with respect. People greeted her kindly, and children often smiled at her without hesitation. Some of the older townsfolk even nodded deeply as she passed, a gesture of honor that spoke more than words. Elena noticed these changes, but she did not let them swell her pride. She had lived long enough to know that admiration could fade just as quickly as mockery. What mattered was not what people thought of her, but what they learned from the truth she had revealed. Still, a thought lingered in her mind. The scars she had shown had spoken for her, but they were silent reminders. They told people that she had endured hardship, but they did not explain the reasons, the choices, or the sacrifices behind them. For years she had carried the weight of her memories alone. Perhaps now it was time to share, not to seek pity or honor, but to teach. One morning, Elena made a decision. She walked to the small town school, where children gathered to learn letters, numbers, and stories of history. The teacher, a gentle man named Tomasz, looked surprised to see her standing at the door. "Elena," he greeted warmly, though with a hint of caution. "What brings you here?" "I want to speak to the children," Elena replied calmly. "I want them to know the truth about what scars can mean." Tomasz studied her face for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "They will listen," he said. "More than you think." The next day, Elena stood before the class. The children sat in rows of wooden desks, their eyes wide with curiosity. They had heard whispers of what had happened in the marketplace, but now they looked at her directly, waiting. She began simply. "You have heard stories about me," she said. "Some are true, some are not. But what you should know is that scars are not always marks of weakness. Sometimes they are marks of courage." The children listened quietly, their small faces serious. Elena told them about her time during the war, not the violent details, but the lessons. She spoke of standing with others, protecting those who could not protect themselves, and enduring hardships not for glory, but for peace. She told them about loyalty, about sacrifice, and about the importance of kindness. Her words painted pictures in their young minds. They imagined her standing tall among soldiers, not as a fighter seeking victory, but as a woman holding her ground for something greater. They saw her scars not as something ugly, but as symbols of bravery. When she finished, the classroom was silent. Then a small boy raised his hand. "Does it hurt?" he asked softly. Elena looked at him with gentle eyes. "It does not hurt now," she replied. "But sometimes the memory hurts more than the wound. And that is why we must choose kindness, because cruel words and actions can leave scars just as deep as battles." The children nodded, and their teacher's eyes glistened with quiet respect. That day, the lesson Elena gave was more powerful than any found in a book. News of her visit spread quickly. Soon, others began to invite her to speak. A group of women asked her to share her story at the town gathering. A few young men, humbled by their earlier mistakes, requested to hear from her directly, hoping to learn what it truly meant to carry scars with dignity. Elena hesitated at first. She had never liked being the center of attention. But she realized that sharing her story was no longer about herself. It was about planting seeds of understanding in those who might otherwise repeat the same mistakes as the young men in the marketplace. At the gathering, people filled the small hall, eager to hear her words. She stood at the front, her hands clasped gently, her eyes sweeping across familiar faces. Some had once mocked her, others had ignored her, but now they all waited in silence. "I am not here to speak of battles," she began. "Nor to remind you of suffering. I am here to remind you of what survival means. It means carrying the weight of others, even when it is heavy. It means standing when you wish to fall. And it means remembering that scars are not to be feared, but to be respected, for they tell the story of what has been endured." Her words flowed steadily, each one sinking deep into the hearts of those who listened. Some wept quietly. Others lowered their heads in shame for the times they had judged her. The young men who had mocked her in the marketplace sat at the back, their eyes fixed on the ground, but their hearts wide open. When she finished, the room erupted in applause, not the shallow clapping of entertainment, but the heartfelt rhythm of gratitude. People stood to honor her, not as a distant figure, but as one of their own, someone who had given more than they ever realized. Elena's life slowly transformed after that. She did not become famous, nor did she seek titles or honors. But she became something far more meaningful, a living lesson. People came to her not for gossip, but for guidance. Children walked beside her on her way to the marketplace, asking her questions about life, kindness, and courage. Mothers spoke to their sons and daughters about her, using her story as a reminder to respect those they did not understand. Even the young men who had once humiliated her grew different. They began to work harder, to treat others with respect, and to prove that they had learned their lesson. One of them even began to help Tomasz at the school, guiding younger children and ensuring they never repeated his mistakes. Through it all, Elena remained humble. She still lived in her small house, tended her garden, and walked quietly through the streets. But wherever she went, people no longer saw a quiet stranger. They saw resilience. They saw dignity. They saw a woman who carried scars that spoke louder than words. One evening, Elena stood at the edge of town, looking at the horizon. The sun was setting, painting the sky in fiery hues of red and gold. She closed her eyes and remembered those she had lost, comrades who had not survived to see peace. For a moment, grief filled her heart, but then she felt something else: gratitude. She had lived, not just for herself, but for them. And through sharing her story, she was keeping their memory alive. As the stars began to appear, she whispered softly, "Your sacrifices were not in vain. They live on in the lessons I pass to others." Her voice was carried away by the wind, but the truth of her words remained. The town was changing, becoming gentler, kinder, more respectful. And though Elena never sought to be a teacher, she had become one not through lectures or authority, but through scars that told stories stronger than any book could hold. For the first time in many years, Elena felt that her silence had found a voice. And that voice was not hers alone, it belonged to every survivor, every soul who carried scars seen or unseen. Time passed, but Elena's presence in the town never faded. She moved quietly, as always, yet the influence she had began to touch every part of the community. People no longer remembered her as the young woman who had once been mocked, they remembered her as someone who had endured, survived, and taught them the value of courage, humility, and understanding. One crisp morning, a letter arrived for Elena. It was from a university in the city, inviting her to speak at a conference on resilience and courage. At first, she hesitated. The thought of leaving her quiet town and standing in front of strangers filled her with nervousness. But then she considered what she had learned. Sharing her story had helped her community, had changed people's hearts. Perhaps she could do the same on a larger scale. After some thought, she accepted the invitation. She packed her small suitcase, not with fancy clothes or belongings, but with memories and lessons, carrying her scars not as shame but as symbols of the journey she had endured. The journey itself was symbolic, the quiet woman of a small town now traveling to the city to speak to hundreds who had never met her, to share lessons forged in hardship and resilience. At the university, Elena found herself in a grand hall filled with people eager to hear her speak. She noticed young students, professors, and even some people who had endured struggles similar to hers. She took a deep breath, feeling a familiar tremor of anxiety, but it was quickly replaced by a steady resolve. She stepped to the podium. "I am not here as a hero," she began. "I am not here to tell you that I am better than anyone else. I am here to tell you that scars, visible or hidden, are part of every human journey. They remind us of where we have been, what we have endured, and what we are capable of overcoming." Her voice was calm but carried strength. She spoke of fear, of humiliation, and of moments when giving up seemed easier than moving forward. But she also spoke of hope, of small acts of courage, and of the power that comes from telling one's story truthfully. She shared the story of the marketplace, where she had been humiliated, and how those moments had changed her, not by breaking her, but by giving her purpose. The audience listened intently. Some held back tears, others nodded, their minds reflecting on their own struggles. Elena realized that what she had once considered a burden, her scars, had become her most powerful tool. They were tangible proof that survival and strength were not about avoiding hardship, but facing it and using it to grow. After her speech, people came forward. A young woman approached her with tears in her eyes. "Your story, it gives me hope," she said. "I thought my scars made me weak. But now I see that they make me strong." Elena smiled softly. They make you strong, yes. But remember, strength is not about fighting alone. It is about facing challenges with honesty, compassion, and courage. Share your story, and you will help others. In the days that followed, Elena spoke to many groups, some at schools, others at community centers, and a few in small conferences. Everywhere she went, people listened, reflected, and shared their own experiences. Her story had grown beyond her own life, connecting to the lives of others who had endured pain, shame, or fear. But despite the attention, Elena remained humble. She returned to her small town as often as possible, tending her garden, walking along the quiet streets, and visiting the school where she had first spoken to children. The little ones still remembered her lessons. Some ran to greet her, eager to share what they had learned or done since she last visited. Their excitement and respect warmed her heart, and she felt the same sense of purpose she had felt years ago when she first decided to share her truth. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Elena sat by her window, reflecting on the journey she had traveled. She thought about the young men in the marketplace who had once humiliated her. She remembered how shame had once filled her heart, but now gratitude replaced bitterness. The town had grown kinder, stronger, and more compassionate. Her story had sparked change, and in return, she felt a deep sense of peace. Her memories also wandered to her lost friends, those who had fought alongside her or endured hardships she could not forget. She whispered their names softly, acknowledging their sacrifices and the role they played in shaping her. She realized that the scars on her chest were more than reminders of pain, they were symbols of love, loyalty, and resilience. Every mark told a story of courage, not just hers, but of those who had touched her life in ways both visible and invisible. One day, a young journalist arrived in town, eager to document Elena's story. He wanted to understand how someone could endure so much yet remain gentle, kind, and unbroken. Elena welcomed him into her home, serving tea as she began to recount her journey once more. But this time, she noticed something new. The journalist was not there for sensationalism. He listened with respect, asked thoughtful questions, and reflected on the lessons behind the scars rather than the scars themselves. "You have inspired many," he said, closing his notebook. "But tell me, Elena, what inspired you to keep going when it seemed impossible?" Elena paused, her eyes distant for a moment. "It was not one thing," she said softly. "It was the hope that my struggle could mean something. That my scars could help others see strength in themselves. Every act of kindness I received, every small gesture of support, reminded me that no one faces life alone. And one day, I realized that even my scars, which once made me feel exposed and ashamed, could become a source of courage for me and for others." The journalist nodded, deeply moved. He understood that Elena's story was not just about survival, it was about transformation, empathy, and the quiet power of living with integrity despite hardship. Months passed, and Elena's influence spread even further. People from neighboring towns began visiting, wanting to hear her story, to learn from her experiences, and to understand how to face their own struggles. Elena welcomed them all, not as a celebrity, but as a guide, a listener, and a teacher of life's deepest lessons. She also continued to mentor the younger generation in her town. Many of them had once been unsure of themselves, shy, or fearful. Under her guidance, they began to grow in confidence, learning that mistakes, failures, and even scars did not define their worth. They discovered that resilience was built not by avoiding hardship, but by facing it with courage and honesty. One afternoon, Elena visited the marketplace once again. She walked slowly, remembering the day when she had been humiliated, and the young men had laughed at her. Now, the same people greeted her respectfully. Some bowed slightly, others smiled warmly. She could see the change in their hearts, the understanding that cruelty served no purpose and that respect and empathy were far more powerful. For the first time in years, Elena felt complete. She had transformed her pain into a force that brought people together, inspired growth, and taught kindness. Her scars, once a source of shame, were now a symbol of victory not over others, but over fear, anger, and the desire for revenge. She had become a living testament to the power of resilience, courage, and compassion. As night fell, she returned home, sitting quietly by the window. The stars twinkled above, and the town rested peacefully below. Elena smiled softly, her heart full. She knew her story was not finished, for it lived on in every person she had touched, every lesson she had shared, and every act of kindness inspired by her courage. In that moment, Elena understood something profound: scars do not define us, but the way we face them does. The marks on her chest, the hardships she had endured, and the moments of pain she had survived were not chains to hold her back. They were wings, carrying her to a life of meaning, purpose, and connection. And as the wind whispered through the trees, Elena felt a quiet joy. She had faced the world, revealed her truth, and in doing so, had transformed herself and her community. Her scars, once a secret she had feared exposing, were now a story that could inspire generations. And in that story, Elena had finally found peace.